Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you as always from the CHEK News World Headquarters here in Victoria. BC's decriminalization issue grips federal politics, putting even more pressure on provincial politicians, plus the province's short-term rental crackdown begins, and we reflect on one of the most controversial projects of all time that just completed, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We are going to jump into all of that, and Jeff and Jillian are here to help us break it all down. So let us start with one word, and that word is wacko. That is what federal opposition leader Pierre Poilievre called BC's decriminalization project this week. He also called the Prime Minister that, and he got himself booted out of question period, which kickstarted what was basically an entire week in Ottawa focused on BC's request to recriminalize drug use and possession in public places. The pressure that seems to have been created nationally here on Premier David Eby's request, is it filtering down? Does it change anything on the decriminalization project and where the government stands? What do we make of that sort of intense national focus, Jeff?
Well, on the intense national focus, seems to me that our federal parliament is failing us in a big way. We've got these so-called leaders playing playground politics with serious issues like toxic drug deaths. It's like they never grew up past the sandbox. I would prefer to see some real talk and real action from them instead of meme-worthy buzzwords and silliness. And let's call out kind of the underlying policy nonsense here too. You've got politicians saying we got to end decriminalization. We can just turn back the clock in BC and everything will be great and we'll solve all of the problems. Well, let's look at the facts. You compare BC with places like Alaska and Alberta, right close to us. They have no safe supply. They have no decriminalization. In Alaska, death rate soaring by 45%. Alberta is up by 17%. In BC, it's up 5%. And we're all in the same ballpark in terms of death per 100,000. It's not perfect what we're doing in British Columbia. There's too many people still dying. But at least we're showing some signs of stabilizing. And what we're hearing from federal politicians is playground epithets, underline and hiding. I don't know how you underline and hide at the same time, but hiding the fact that the policy prescription is going to make things worse and not better. So I would hope to see a little bit more serious work on this from all of our federal politicians.
It does raise a question we sort of hit on last week when this was announced, but Jillian, like if the federal Conservatives and the provincial BC United are all asking why the province doesn't just scrap decriminalization, we sort of end up, despite Jeff's kind of points there, we sort of end up with this version of decrim that will still exist, but only in private residences and doesn't really seem to meet the original targets. And is it worth even fighting to keep it around at this point if we have all this federal noise and provincial politics around it?
I think, I think it's worth continuing to at least, add some credence to the idea that it should be a health issue. Even the police that were testifying in Ottawa that sort of kicked off this debate or brought it to a new level at the federal level recently said that they don't want to go backwards, but just that, the sort of reality that people are seeing in hospitals and in public places is too strong to ignore. So I think it is worthwhile to sort of, continue to show that leadership at a provincial level that we're trying to at least move towards treating it more like a healthcare issue. In the practical sense, though, I think you're right. I think that we are going to see some of the harms of criminalization being kind of repeated now that, drugs can be seized, people can be arrested. But, I think it's still worthwhile, like continuing to see the pilot through. It's supposed to go till 2026. especially because it's not just private residences, it's also safe consumption sites, places like that, which we need more of. Those save lives. So I think it's, worthwhile continuing to have in place. But having the federal spotlight on it, I think, is filtering back into the provincial politics. We saw Kevin Falcon sort of taking stronger lines this week saying that we should keep stigmatization of drugs. So that's a good thing. We've had this dynamic for a while where, both the provincial Conservatives and BC United are courting those Pierre Poilievre votes. So they're starting to sort of adopt that more radical, stronger framing when we're hearing it in Ottawa. So I think, the politics of this is sort of getting jumbled with this big federal spotlight on it this week.
One of the reasons why we like to live in British Columbia, all of us, is that there's this big mountains that separate us from Ottawa. And anytime in this day and age, when Ottawa comes into British Columbia, it makes policy and work here a heck of a lot more difficult. And I wish sometimes that those folks in Ottawa would just stick to their own town and their own issues and not get in the middle of stuff here. Like, let's be real. Any politician that tells you they can snap their fingers and make all drug overdoses disappear is full of baloney. Not as long as there's a demand for hard drugs and scumbag dealers pushing deadly stuff like fentanyl. The practical stuff that we can do, and there are things that we can do, is kind of boring. Doesn't make headlines. Early intervention, harm reduction, emergency response, treatment options, social support. So, no federal politician is going to talk about Foundry centers for at-risk use or overdose prevention sites that get 75,000 visits a month, or naloxone kits being used 160,000 times. And isn't that a good thing? And thousands getting the treatment they need at, we've got 3,600 inpatient treatment beds in BC, and it's up 600. And complex care housing, they're building more in Abbotsford and Bella Coola and Victoria and Vancouver. It's not exciting. It's not great for memes, but it's kind of serious. It's hard to communicate, but it's the kind of serious work you have to do to deal with the crisis that's not going to be solved by saying wacko and putting out memes on social media.
Yeah, it's also an open question if that is working and to what extent it's working, and whether the government can explain to people why it might be working. So that's an issue. But I want to ask, do either of you think that there is any way Ottawa says no to BC's request and just gets out of Decrim entirely, shuts it down, gets out of the kind of daily hit that it is taking from its opponents on this issue and just backs right off? Or do either of you think that? I'm not sure.
I'd be surprised. It occurred to me, but I'd be surprised. The Prime Minister has said that the reason that he, went ahead with this in BC and the City of Toronto is also asking for it is because the Premier specifically asked for it, and he's still asking for it, just with these new exemptions. So I would be really surprised to see that. I think, the Conservatives, both provincially and federally, are showing that they're not going to stop at decriminalization. They're also going after safe supply. So I'm not sure, I don't think that it would. I think they just end up kind of, upsetting more people on both sides of the debate if they did that. But you never know. I think politically, the federal government is pretty desperate, so could happen.
Yeah, if they're not going to say no, they should just say yes and get on with it, because they spent the latter half of the week, under attack. That the longer they take to agree to BC's change, the worse the situation gets. So they're sort of in the worst of both worlds there. Jeff, any final thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, I agree with Jillian on all those points. You also asked, well, how can we tell if the safe supply, decrim approach, and all the other measures are working in BC? You've pointed out often the lack of data, so we need more data. But we can look, as I noted, death rates in jurisdictions close to us that are trying different things. And what we're seeing in those places is that death rates are increasing at an alarming rate. And in BC, they're increasing by a much, much smaller amount. So that's a anecdotal, at least, sign that it's on the right. The steps that are being taken are making a difference. Not enough. Yeah. There's still too many people dying. We need to do better. We need to do more. But it's better than just saying decrim, let's get rid of it and go back to the way things were, because they weren't working. And they're not. Okay. Other places are doing them.
changing subjects here. This past week was also the start date for BC's short-term rental crackdown, which bans most urban BC homeowners from being able to list their investment properties on Airbnb and Vrbo. We've been hearing back and forth in the lead up to this for months now. I think the NDP's effectively managed to frame this as a homes are for people, not investors thing, but critics are still saying there's going to be consequences for folks on vacations and taking trips and driving up the prices of hotels. So Jillian, is this still a win for the NDP government, this policy? Are they selling it properly? Is there any risk of kind of blowback as this thing actually gets off the ground and into reality?
I think there is. We saw some small kind of, examples coming out. I saw one that was compelling. It's still legal to have a secondary short-term rental in a secondary suite in your house. So, story on CBC, I think it was about homeowners considering converting their long-term rental into a short-term rental because now they're going to have a competitive advantage. So I think we'll start to see some of these kind of unintended consequences sort of shake out and maybe generate some bad press. And yeah, I think, when people go to book a vacation and they find that there's things not available, some people will probably be a little bit irked by that. But I think that by and large, when it comes time to campaign on the issue, the government will still have, sort of a net political benefit to this idea that they're doing everything that they can, that they're taking a strong line to make sure that homes are for people. So I think, it's something that they can't drop and need to continue to sort of push their messaging out on, but maybe not as strong of a win as the first time they came out with it.
Jeff, that idea that, and I agree with Jillian, but that idea that the campaign message or the one line about going after investors in the housing market is so strong that the government can seem to withstand, like, for example, the announcement of the FIFA World Cup contract this week, which could have been a positive for BC. That's a whole other issue, but there's lots of questions built into it on, well, where are people going to stay and the Airbnb restrictions and the hotel prices. Like, it feels like we're going to get that embedded into things again and again and again, plus the unintended consequences. And yet the overall message seems strong enough for government to sort of withstand that and turn it into a positive.
Yeah, it's a powerful story, and there absolutely will be implementation challenges. That the hotel lobby has given itself high fives behind the scenes because they've kneecapped in many ways a big competitor. And now they're going to government asking for public subsidies to build hotels because there's not enough accommodation after they got their competitors out of the market. There's lots of fun stuff here, but it's the story here is, and what it conveys to voters about the values of government on the issue. Government expects to be the ballot question in the election on housing affordability. Why are you fixated on short-term rentals? Because it conveys real homes that people desperate for long-term housing could actually live in. Housing is for people. The government is, saying it's putting the needs of everyday people before profit-driven interest. That if you're an ordinary citizen struggling to find affordable housing, the government's got your back. So the story's powerful. Is it working? Again, anecdotally, we've heard stories from people who've already found housing as a result of this. I'll tell you, someone who's got two thumbs and is in that boat. It's this guy, right? I recently needed to move to a new rental apartment, and I was able to find one at a pretty reasonable rate, close to my kid's school, because it used to be a short-term rental. The owner didn't want to run it anymore, sold it to someone who wanted to do as a long-term rental, and I was able to get into it. And I know this, it's still got the bathroom drawer with a lock on it where they would keep the cleaning supplies. We'll need to see over the long term what impact it has. But it's a powerful story. You have the anecdotal stories that help make the case for government. And it's going to be a big issue in the election. So here we are.
It's good points. I remember when this bill was being debated in the House, BC United had a line that maybe we should let everyone have one investment property they can rent on Airbnb. I don't hear them saying that anymore, but is that a sellable election challenge to this? Do you think a party could take that out and say, let's keep Airbnb, everyone gets one Airbnb? I don't know. Do either of you think that might be an opening for the opposition on this?
I don't think that's compelling to most people. I think I mean, it kind of depends what voters you're going for. United is kind of usually tends to be battling for higher income, older voters who might, already have an income property or be looking to invest in one. I think if you're, larger and larger share of the voting population is millennials. I think they're the largest share of the voting population now who are just trying to, get by either by renting or possibly one day owning one place. So I don't think that's like a super compelling platform idea for anybody. I think, we even see at the federal level, the Liberals going ahead and removing the capital gains exemption for secondary properties and investment properties. So I think, things are kind of trending that way. Cracking down more on investment is a lot more politically palatable right now.
An interesting milestone this past week, the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which twins the existing pipe from Edmonton to Burnaby, triples the capacity of oil flowing from Alberta to the Lower Mainland, mainly for export, and is a hugely significant project in BC political history, defining the earliest days of the NDP government in 2017 and its efforts to sort of challenge this, and picked up the Green support and kind of, in some ways, contributed to Kinder Morgan having to sell this pipeline to Ottawa, which has put taxpayers across the country in on this project. So Jillian, way back in 2017, the debate about this pipeline, which is now finished, we don't hear people talk about it anymore. It just seems to have sort of faded away, but it was a pretty significant political story for the better part of a couple of years there.
Yeah, it was huge. It was the one reason that the Greens said that they went with the BC NDP over the BC Liberals and the minority government in the election that year. And then, right away, once they formed that minority government, we saw a big fight between the province and Ottawa. We saw the wine ban from Alberta, where Alberta wasn't buying BC wine. Lots of drama and court cases. But once those court cases wrapped up, the province sort of said, those are all the tools that we have in our toolbox. That was their election slogan at the time. And now it's kind of just sort of quietly progressed towards completion. And I think, what's remarkable is just the fact that not only is none of the opposition, like the NDP government or the Greens, really talking about it, but neither were the proponents in the federal government. This is a $34 billion project. That's almost $900 per Canadian that we've put out for this massive piece of infrastructure. And we saw no ribbon cutting, no press conference. And I think that really speaks to how controversial of a project it is and how sort of symbolic it is probably one of the last big fossil fuel projects that we're going to see built because, the most mainstream kind of International Energy Association and organizations that do projections think that peak oil is going to come by the end of the decade. And these projects are, not even financially viable at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Ottawa didn't want to celebrate it because you're right, that $34 billion was so far above the original $5 billion estimate. It would have been embarrassing to have a ribbon cutting or something like that. So nobody really talked about this thing except for the Alberta government, Jeff, which was very happy to see it. I did briefly talk to Environment Minister George Heyman, and he said BC's position hasn't changed, doesn't like the pipeline, thinks it's a risk of oil spills and tanker traffic, wishes it wasn't built, and still doesn't think it's economically viable, and in some ways possibly was proven correct with all those cost overruns.
Well, they used every tool in the toolbox to try and stop it and couldn't, and here we are. Three things I find interesting about Trans Mountain, and for the folks at home who are only tune in for Ali and the center-right views she brings. Let me give you some content that you can agree with. I'm going to do something out of character. I'm going to say something nice about BC Liberals. Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I find interesting,
it's a trap.
Now this was BC Liberals when Kevin Falcon wasn't there. So there's no credit to him personally. Encourage you all to read Rob's profile of Kevin and his family in Northern Beat. It was a really good piece about him and his family and why he's in this. Have a read. First nice thing I'm going to say, former Premier Christy Clark, to her credit, negotiated a deal that will see BC get $50 million a year for 20 years from the pipeline, despite BC having no say over whether it goes forward or not. And the question now for the BC NDP is, how are you going to spend that? Are you going to dedicate it to climate action, environmental protection, or will go into general revenues. That's $1 billion over 20 years. That's not insubstantial. We're seeing First Nations and communities along the pipeline route getting their benefits agreements are going to kick in. They're going to get rents paid, millions of dollars going to communities there. And interesting to me is that the pipeline's biggest opponent through all this debate, the city of Burnaby, is going to get the most money of anyone. I wonder if they'll give it back on a matter of principle. Probably not. The interesting go forward question now is ownership of this pipeline. Government of Canada owns it now, says it wants to sell it. Who's going to buy it? Likely a group involving First Nations. It'll be interesting to see which ones, what the cost is, under what conditions, and how the federal government is going to ensure that the public interest is protected on the sale of what is right now a $34 billion public asset. So you may think the story's over, but it's only what did the Carpenters say? We've only just begun.
It's hard to imagine the Fed selling this pipeline for $34 billion to a group of Indigenous investors to recover the money. So probably taxpayers. We're going to take a loss on this thing for sure. Which is, I guess, the legacy of this project is it's going to cost you in the end of the day. But a very fascinating moment in BC politics. An example of an issue that can dominate and then just 5-6 years later, peter out without anyone actually even talking about it when the first oil starts flowing across the border. There was some discussion at some point along this way that if we could triple our oil and refine gas capacity, we might get lower gas prices in BC because this is the primary way we get our gasoline. But that argument is not coming up now because most of this is going to export either. So there's no benefit for the gas consuming customer here to celebrate that either. So anyways.
We're what the business people call price takers. It's the prices aren't set by the amount of oil that comes into the market. It's set by global markets and what the price of a barrel of oil is. So that was an interesting argument. But as folks who fuel up their cars know, it's not working. Maybe it's time to get one of those electric vehicles.
Electric vehicles, right. Well, we'll talk about that in the future as well, because that leads into electricity capacity and all of those types of issues. But thank you to both of you for being here this week. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the CHEK Plus app, YouTube, and your podcast feeds. And we'll be back with all the latest in BC politics next week here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.